The Venator might be the sexiest Star Destroyer ever built. That's a design argument, not nostalgia. Kuat Drive Yards built 1,137 meters of warship, capable of simultaneously performing two missions that conventional military logic insists require two separate hulls. Twin flight deck trenches run the full length of the dorsal surface, launching entire fighter wings into the engagement, while the ship's own heavy turbolaser batteries are still firing. Independent timing cycles, no operational conflict between them. Below the keel, the ventral hangar bay handles parallel operations. Supply transfers, shuttle launches, ground assault staging, none of it touching the dorsal cycle above. 7,400 officers, pilots, and enlisted crew. 2,000 troops. 20,000 metric tons of cargo. Consumables rated for 2 years of sustained operations without resupply. The wedge silhouette alone announced what was coming. That knife-edge prow, cutting toward you at combat speed. Every battery along the dorsal length already tracking. Fighter wings already off the deck while the hull was still closing distance. The Venator was a statement that contained its own threat inside its own design. During the Clone Wars, Republic admirals took that hull into the worst of it and used it as carrier, line warship, and command platform inside the same engagement, sometimes within the same hour. The Separatist fleets ran droid-based formations that required mass fighter response to swarm and suppress. The Venator's dual-hangar layout was a direct answer to that tactical reality. Launch the fighters from the dorsal deck, press the engagement with the turbolaser batteries, coordinate the ground assault from below. One ship, one commander, one operation. Then the Clone Wars ended, the Empire formed, and within a few years, the Venators were gone. What replaced them, and what existed alongside their replacements, is the story that the standard Star Destroyer list format keeps failing to tell. Every version of that list has the same architecture. Venator as the romantic opener, Victory-class and Imperial-class through the middle, Executor as the obvious finale, maybe a Tector or Secutor if the creator did extra reading. Then it stops. The Praetor-class battlecruiser, both the Mark I and the Mark II, gets no coverage, despite being among the most capable vessels Kuat Drive Yards ever produced. The Procurator class appears as a footnote at best, when its operational history alone earns it a full segment. The ships caught between the Star Destroyer and Star Dreadnought categories, the ones the Anaxis War College system's own taxonomy can't cleanly contain, get omitted by default because the classification problem is inconvenient, and the list that came before set the template. This video isn't the corrected final list. It's the one that finally takes the gaps seriously, because the ships that fall through the cracks connect into a story about a military doctrine that deliberately narrowed its own design vocabulary, and in doing so, buried an entire generation of capable vessels in the institutional preference for standardized, scalable terror. In 18 BBY, 1 year after the execution of Order 66 and the formal dissolution of the Galactic Republic, Grand Moff Wilhuff Tarkin presented Emperor Palpatine with a formal strategic document, Imperial Communique No. 001044.92V. Its official designation was the Doctrine of Fear. History calls it the Tarkin Doctrine. 3 operational principles. Territorial consolidation first. The Empire would create oversectors, massive administrative regions each governed by a single imperial official answering directly to the Emperor. The Republic had lost territory, tax revenue, and military coherence to criminal networks and insurgent movements operating in the jurisdictional gaps between sector governments. Populations in the seams where one authority ended and the next hadn't started. Oversectors closed those gaps. No administrative ambiguity. One chain of command, from the local governor to Palpatine himself. The second principle was communications. HoloNet access restricted to the Imperial military exclusively. No secure network for insurgents to organize on. No encrypted channels that didn't run through Imperial relay stations. cut the communications infrastructure, and you cut the organizational capacity for distributed resistance before it can become a military problem. The third principle was the one that changed the shape of the fleet. Tarkin stated it as a maxim, and the maxim is the engine behind everything that follows. Rule through fear of force, rather than through force itself. The strategic logic was elegant and cold. A galaxy where every planetary government, every shipping consortium, every organized resistance movement lives in genuine terror of what resistance costs, is a galaxy that can be controlled at a fraction of the cost of physically fighting everywhere at once. You don't garrison 10,000 systems by posting troops on all 10,000. You garrison them by making sure every governor on every one of those worlds has watched what happened to the last system that resisted, has performed the calculation, and has decided the math doesn't work. The Death Star was the physical endpoint of that reasoning, a weapon that could end a civilization in a single sustained discharge, whose mere existence was supposed to close off the decision tree at the point where armed resistance becomes thinkable. The HoloNet restrictions supported this in a specific way that fed back into procurement. If insurgents couldn't communicate freely across sector boundaries, the scenarios that most demanded carrier-based rapid response force projection, distributed multi-system uprisings that required a mobile, flexible military response, were less likely to develop into operational military problems. A navy built around stationary deterrence could afford to be less flexible if the communications infrastructure that enabled coordinated resistance was already compromised. Tarkin wasn't just writing a military doctrine. He was engineering an environment in which one particular type of military doctrine would work. The Death Star was years from completion in 18 BBY. In the meantime, the doctrine's logic filtered into every procurement decision the Imperial Navy made. Its effect on ship design was specific and far-reaching. The Venator had been built for a republic, fighting a distributed war across the width of the galaxy, against an enemy that could appear in any system, at any moment, in formations ranging from massed capital ship engagements to planetary sieges to single-ship intercept missions. Flexibility wasn't a design preference for the Republic Navy. It was a survival requirement. A hull that could launch fighters, command a sector fleet, suppress a planetary surface, and trade fire with a Separatist dreadnought in the same operation was what that conflict demanded. The Tarkin Doctrine had no use for that war. The doctrine was planning to prevent wars, not win them, and the instrument of prevention wasn't carrier-based flexible force projection. It was presence, scale. An Imperial-class Star Destroyer in orbit above a capital city communicates one thing without firing a shot. The decision to resist has already been made for you. That shift in procurement priorities meant a shift in what the Imperial Navy valued in its senior officers. The admirals who had built careers around coordinating fighter wings across multiple carriers, managing the complex timing cycles of dual-hangar operations during multi-vector engagements. Their operational philosophy was being systematically deprioritized. The Empire didn't need admirals who could run carrier group doctrine. It needed admirals who could position a capital ship where it would be seen, who could project the visual vocabulary of overwhelming force without necessarily deploying it. The culture of the officer corps and the culture of the shipyard adapted together. Kuat Drive Yards, as the dominant supplier of Imperial naval assets, adapted with them. As the Death Star project moved toward completion in the years following the doctrine's formalization, the Navy's senior admirals shifted toward what was being internally described as terror styling, a design language that prioritized visible, communicable scale and concentrated firepower over the operational adaptability that had defined Republic-era procurement. Carrier capacity became secondary in a culture reorganizing itself around deterrence as the primary weapon. A ship that could do everything was, in this framework, a ship spreading its statement too thin. The Venator phased out. Its operational load had to go somewhere. The Victory class was already in Republic service when the Empire formed and absorbed some of what the Venator had handled, particularly the mid-weight warship role. Its armament profile was heavier than the Venator's in direct capital ship engagement terms, and it carried less fighter capacity, reflecting a procurement preference that was already shifting before the Empire formally existed. The Gladiator class had been specifically designed during the Clone Wars as a Republic escort vessel for the Victory class. Legend sources are explicit that the Gladiator's operational design was built around accompanying the heavier Victory rather than operating independently. That escort function placed it in a different role than anything the Venator had occupied. Both classes were products of Kuat Drive Yards. Both were smaller and more function-specific than the Venator. Neither preserved its full carrier capability at comparable scale. Eventually, the Imperial class consolidated everything. 1,600 meters, 37,000 crew, 100 heavy and standard turbolasers, 10 tractor beam projectors. One hull type that could serve as line warship, sector command platform, and visible deterrent simultaneously. Not because it was operationally flexible in the Venator's sense, but because the Empire intended to have enough of them that operational flexibility became irrelevant. Deploy an Imperial class in every major system, and the question of whether it can cover multiple mission types in the same engagement never needs to be answered. The vessel itself becomes the message. Mass-producible, standardized, the same visual, the same scale, the same statement transmitted across every system where the Imperial Navy maintained a presence. Wherever you were in the galaxy, the silhouette was the same. That was the point. What the lists stop there and miss is that Kuat Drive Yards didn't stop there either. The Anaxis War College System is the classification framework the Republic and the Empire used to organize their naval assets. The formal taxonomy that sorted warships from frigates through destroyers, cruisers, and battlecruisers, up to the top designation, Star Dreadnought. The Executor class sits there, at 19,000 meters, the physical embodiment of what the Tarkin Doctrine was building toward when resources were unlimited. The boundaries between categories aren't determined by length alone. Armament density, operational role, and tactical function all factor in. But scale is one of the primary sorting criteria at the upper end of the hierarchy, and that generates a predictable problem. A ship can grow large enough to clear one size threshold, while its armament profile doesn't match the next category's expectations. The system creates a gap. The ships that live in that gap are the ones these lists consistently miss. Too large for the Star Destroyer category. Too lightly armed for the Star Dreadnought designation. Officially designated battlecruisers, and therefore outside the frame of reference the list format is working from. The story of why they ended up there, who built them, what doctrine they served, why the classification system couldn't accommodate them cleanly, is inseparable from the story of the Tarkin Doctrine that shaped them. The Procurator-class Star Battlecruiser is old in a way that has direct operational consequences. Kuat Drive Yards introduced the class approximately 219 years before the Battle of Yavin. That places its design origin in the Ruusan era, a period of galactic history so far removed from the Clone Wars that the governments, doctrines, and strategic contexts that shaped it were several civilizational layers back. The Republic that commissioned this ship wasn't the prequel-era Republic. It predated the institutions that Palpatine transformed, the clone army that fought for them, and the Jedi Order that led that army. By 3 ABY, when Imperial fleet records place a Procurator class operating as part of a high-mobility formation attached to Death Squadron, Darth Vader's personal fleet, the most operationally prestigious command in the Imperial Navy, that ship design had been in continuous service for over 2 centuries. A 219-year operational lifespan doesn't mean the same hull has been running since the Ruusan era without modification. A ship surviving that long through multiple governments and doctrine shifts has been refitted, rearmed, and structurally updated through technological generations that wouldn't be recognizable to its original designers. The weapon systems active on a Procurator in Vader's fleet in 3 ABY aren't the weapons it carried when first commissioned. The whole platform is old. Everything mounted on it has been replaced and updated multiple times over. The Imperial Navy valued this because a 219-year-old platform is an amortized platform. The design and production costs are ancient history. The development debt has been paid off across a dozen administrations, and the maintenance budget is devoted to keeping current-generation weapons functional on a structure that has already proved its integrity across 2 centuries of operational stress. At 2,500 meters, the Procurator slots between the Imperial class at 1,600 meters and the Praetor Mark I at 4,000 meters. Large enough to project meaningful force at the capital ship level, fast enough for the escort and intercept duties its tactical doctrine assigned it. But the number that defines the Procurator's operational identity isn't its length. It's the number that isn't there. The Procurator carries no ventral hangar bays. The keel isn't designed for starfighter storage or ground assault staging. There's no fighter wing housed below the primary hull. No secondary launch capacity integrated into the lower structure. For a Kuat Drive Yards design operating alongside Imperial-class ships, that absence is a deliberate statement of design philosophy rather than a structural oversight. The Imperial class carries its fighter complement as a default operational tool. Fighters provide cover, conduct reconnaissance, handle the medium-range engagement layer that capital ship turbolasers can't address efficiently. The Procurator gives that space to something else: forward-mounted weapon systems, heavy bow armor reinforcing the primary gun arcs, torpedo batteries capable of sustained capital ship engagement. Every ton of mass that didn't go into hangar infrastructure went into killing power instead. That design choice produces something close to what early naval theorists might call a pocket battleship. A small frame with large guns, a hull that concentrates capital ship firepower into a platform that moves fast enough for intercept duty, without the operational flexibility a carrier component would provide. The Procurator is entirely, deliberately committed to direct engagement. No fallback, no fighter cover it can generate independently, no ground assault capability it can offer a combined arms formation. The design assumes its guns won't need a secondary option. Fleet sources describe the Procurator in tactical terms as an escort vessel and formation anchor, positioned at the rear or outer flanks of large formations to intercept threats approaching the primary force, to run down vessels attempting to disengage, to hold the defensive envelope that lighter assets in the formation can't maintain on their own. A ship that functions as both anchor and interceptor gives the formation commander a reliable fixed point around which the rest of the fleet can maneuver. That reliability, that predictability of what the ship will do in a deteriorating engagement, is itself a tactical asset. Before going further, the Procurator class isn't the Procurator class. 2 different ships, 2 different designs, nearly identical names, regularly conflated in fleet catalogs and community discussions alike. The Procurator is a smaller vessel, closer to 1,200 meters, operating in a different part of the tactical spectrum. Both are Kuat Drive Yards products. Both embody similar design principles around concentrated armament and reduced operational flexibility. But they're separate entries in the catalog, and the Procurator's actual specifications get buried under the wrong ship's data often enough that the distinction is worth stating plainly. The Procurator was still in Imperial service by 3 ABY. Its presence in Death Squadron, in the formation directly under Vader's command at one of the war's most consequential operational periods, suggests a ship that had demonstrated enough sustained usefulness across enough doctrinal regimes to earn its place in the most elite Imperial fleet assignment available. A Ruusan-era design in Vader's personal order of battle in the lead-up to the Battle of Hoth isn't a legacy vessel being kept on out of bureaucratic inertia. It's a ship that still does something the fleet needs done. One Legends account records a derelict Procurator whose reactor was removed by Rebel Alliance operatives and repurposed to power the planetary ion cannon at Echo Base on Hoth. If that account is accurate, the Procurator contributed to the Battle of Hoth from both sides of the engagement, part of the Imperial formation converging on the system, part of the infrastructure enabling the Rebel evacuation. A ship that ends up simultaneously in the attacking fleet and powering the defending battery is a particular kind of record for a 2-century service life. 4,000 meters. Take an Imperial-class Star Destroyer. Take 2 of them and put them end to end. You're 800 meters short of the Praetor Mark I. Take a third and section it just past the midpoint. Now you're there. A hull that Kuat Drive Yards officially designates as a battlecruiser, crewed by 109,000 officers and enlisted personnel, carrying 14,000 troops and passengers, operating 120 TIE fighters in 10 full squadrons alongside walkers, landing craft, and shuttles. The crew number is where the scale stops feeling abstract. The Imperial class runs on 37,000. The Praetor Mark I requires 109,000, nearly 3 times the complement, for a hull that's 2.5 times the length. That's not linear scaling. Internal volume grows faster than length, and the Praetor Mark I fills that volume with the departmental infrastructure a capital ship at this scale requires to function. Damage control teams distributed across a hull massive enough that a breach on the port bow takes minutes to reach from the engineering section. Weapons management coordinating turbolaser batteries across 300 meters of firing arc simultaneously. Fighter operations running 10 squadrons in independent cycling patterns. Medical facilities with the capacity to handle casualties from a sustained fleet engagement. Machine shops capable of repairing major weapon systems without returning to a shipyard. The 109,000-person crew isn't an excess. It's the minimum required to keep this ship operational under combat conditions. The propulsion layout is specific to the scale problem. 3 main ion engines drive the primary hull, backed by 4 secondary auxiliary ion thrusters. 7 propulsion systems, rather than the more concentrated cluster configuration of a standard Star Destroyer. At 4,000 meters, maintaining combat maneuverability requires distributed thrust. The Praetor Mk1 needs to pivot its firing arcs under power, reposition its angle of engagement without drifting into a defensive posture that exposes its flanks. A ship this large that stops moving is a target the size of a small city. The 7-engine layout keeps it moving. The design detail that distinguishes the Praetor Mk1 most clearly from the standard Kuat Drive Yards wedge is the transport ring at the stern. Standard KDY designs use the stern exclusively for propulsion. The main engine cluster defines the rear profile, and logistics capacity lives inside the hull. The Praetor Mk1 integrates a dedicated cargo and equipment ring directly at the stern, a structural feature for storing supplies, equipment, and extended campaign provisions. This is a ship designed for operations far from established resupply infrastructure. The stern ring is the architectural declaration that this vessel expects to sustain itself across campaigns long enough that standard logistics support won't reach it. The 20,000 metric ton cargo capacity of the Venator was sufficient for 2 years of operations. The Praetor's logistics profile suggests comparable ambition at greater scale. Bridge placement reinforces that picture. Positioned forward of the transport ring and dorsal superstructure, the Praetor Mk1's bridge is integrated into the hull mass in a way that provides structural protection around the command space. The standard Star Destroyer bridge tower is exposed, high visibility for the commander, but also the primary target for an opposing fleet trying to decapitate the command structure early in the engagement. The Praetor Mk1 trades some of that visibility for survivability. The command space is harder to reach and harder to disable, at the cost of some direct scanning coverage. In a sustained capital ship engagement, where the ship expects to absorb serious return fire, that trade-off reflects a command philosophy comfortable accepting reduced visibility in exchange for the operational command structure remaining functional through the first exchanges. The armament profile equips the Praetor Mk1 for exactly the spearhead role its design implies. Turbolaser batteries across multiple hull positions, ion cannon installations, heavy tractor beam emitters that can hold opposing capital ships at fixed range while the turbolasers cycle. Exact emplacement counts vary across the Legend's source material, but the consensus operational picture is a ship built to press fleet engagements from the front, to close with opposing capital ships under fire, and to hold the line at the point of maximum contact. The economic constraint anchors all of this in the procurement reality that explains why you haven't seen this ship in every major Imperial fleet. The Praetor Mark I reportedly cost approximately 7 million credits to produce, roughly the equivalent of 5 Imperial-class Star Destroyers from the same budget. The Tarkin Doctrine's preference for a standardized, widely deployed line fleet over a small number of exceptional individual assets had a fiscal argument behind it that this number makes explicit. 5 Imperial-class ships covering 5 systems simultaneously is a different strategic instrument than one Praetor Mark I covering 1. For a doctrine premised on visible, omnipresent deterrence, distribution wins. One magnificent vessel can't be everywhere. 5 standard ones can. The Praetor Mk1 therefore wasn't built for mass deployment. It was built in limited numbers for situations where even the Imperial class wasn't sufficient. Fleet engagements of sufficient scale that a 1,600-meter line warship wasn't enough hull to absorb the engagement and maintain offensive tempo simultaneously. A formation anchor in the most literal sense. The ship around which a major fleet action organizes itself. The asset too large and too capable to sacrifice to tactical uncertainty. The Praetor Mark II is where the classification problem reaches its structural limit, and where the Navy's own taxonomy turned honest about the gap it had created. The confirmed length range is 4,800 meters to approximately 8,000 meters. That upper figure comes from the Legend's description of the Mark II as the equivalent of 5 Imperial II-class Star Destroyers. 5 hulls at 1,600 meters produces the 8,000-meter figure. The range, rather than a single confirmed number, likely reflects variation across multiple sourcebook publications, measuring from different hull reference points over time. What isn't in dispute is the scale relationship. The Mark II isn't a modestly upgraded version of the Mark I. At its upper measurement, it approaches the lower boundary of Super Star Destroyer territory. At 4,800 meters on the conservative end, it's already 20% larger than the Mark I. Either way, it's operating at a scale that the Anaxis War College system had a specific designation prepared for: Star Dreadnought. The armament carries forward the Mark I's fundamental weapons profile: the heavy turbolaser batteries, medium turbolaser emplacements, ion cannons, tractor beam emitters, and long-range ion cannon batteries, in a hull that has grown substantially around them. Crew complement holds at 109,000. Starfighter capacity stays at 120 fighters plus walkers, barges, and shuttles. The stern transport ring carries forward. The bridge forward of superstructure placement carries forward. The Mark II is structurally continuous with the Mark I in its design language, operating the same command philosophy in a significantly larger frame. What changes at this scale is the classification mathematics, and the Anaxis War College system couldn't ignore the arithmetic. The War College's Star Dreadnought category applies to ships whose length and armament both cross the upper threshold simultaneously. The Mark II crosses the size threshold. At 8,000 meters, it's building toward the Executor in length, though not in any other dimension. But its armament profile is calibrated for a battlecruiser role. The gun emplacements are heavy by Star Destroyer standards, but they're not Star Dreadnought weapons. Not the sustained planetary devastation the Eclipse class deploys. Not the fleet-clearing broadside weight of the Executor. The Mark II is a very large ship with battlecruiser guns, and the War College system doesn't have a clean category for that combination. The official designation the Imperial Navy settled on was battlecruiser. Formally, in the records, in the chain of command documentation, on the hull manifests. Not Star Destroyer, not Star Dreadnought, battlecruiser, the middle designation in a hierarchy where the Mark II's size puts it past its stated category, and its armament puts it below the next one. That designation created practical command problems within the Imperial hierarchy that went beyond taxonomy debates. A Star Dreadnought warranted a different level of command authority than a battlecruiser, different strategic oversight, different resource allocation, different position in the fleet's chain of command. An admiral formerly commanding a battlecruiser was commanding an asset that the official classification said was battlecruiser tier, but that was operating at a scale equivalent to 5 line warships, capable of engagements that no genuine battlecruiser should be conducting. The ship's real operational significance and its formal administrative standing didn't correspond, which created ambiguity in how it could be deployed and who had authority to direct it. The consequence of that designation for the historical record is measurable. A list built around Star Destroyer classifications has a taxonomically defensible basis for excluding the Mark II. It's not formally a Star Destroyer. A list covering Star Dreadnoughts has an equally defensible basis for excluding it. It's not formally a Star Dreadnought. The ship belongs to a designation that neither list framework includes, and it disappears between them every time. A vessel potentially 8,000 meters long, manufactured by the dominant shipyard in the galaxy, built by the same company that made the Imperial-class and the Executor, ends up unmentioned in videos claiming complete coverage of Imperial naval assets. The canon question is worth addressing directly because it's one of the mechanisms by which the Praetor gets dismissed entirely in discussions anchored to post-2014 continuity. For most of its documented existence, the Praetor-class lived in Legends material. The pre-2014 expanded universe sources reclassified as non-canonical following the Disney acquisition. In 2021, the reference book Star Wars: Battles That Changed the Galaxy formally identified the Praetor-class within Disney canon. Wikipedia now carries both a canon article and a Legends article for the Mark II. The detailed specification material primarily lives in the older sources, but the ship has crossed the threshold into current continuity. The Legends-only dismissal no longer holds. The Procurator and both marks of the Praetor take up the most space here because their omission is the most consequential. But the catalog extends further, and some of you already know the ships coming next. The Praetor-class destroyer is 850 meters long, a regional outer rim patrol vessel built for the sustained, low-intensity operations that make up the majority of any realistic Imperial enforcement calendar. Not glamorous enough for the highlight lists, indispensable for the day-to-day function of a government trying to maintain order across the outer rim, where the standard ISD deployment can't be everywhere at once. The Turbulent-class Star Destroyer appears in Legends as a distinct line vessel with a different armament configuration than the Victory-class, filling an adjacent role without sharing its design lineage or its doctrinal history. The designation is more familiar in some corners of the lore community than the ship itself, which is part of the problem. The Rejuvenator class appears in older Legends material as a distinct vessel that doesn't make the standard lists. The Chiss Expansionary Defense Force operated Star Destroyer category capital ships with a completely independent design lineage and manufacturer. Not Kuat Drive Yards, not Imperial Doctrine, not the wedge silhouette that KDY made synonymous with military authority in the core systems. An alien-built, alien-operated capital ship class, falling within the Star Destroyer size range without sharing a single institutional ancestor with the Imperial designs it coexisted with. And the Sion Holt, a near-unique vessel in the Legends record, possibly a one-off rather than a production class, that earned a Star Destroyer range designation without ever representing a fleet type the Imperial Navy built toward at scale. One ship, documented, real in the lore, and absent from virtually every list that claims to cover the category. 5 entries, 1 fact each. A list claiming completeness and skipping all of them isn't complete. It's the most replicated version of incomplete, which is a different kind of problem. The Xyston-class Star Destroyer appeared in The Rise of Skywalker as the primary warship of the Sith Eternal Fleet assembled on Exegol. Its defining hardware is the axial superlaser, a planet-killing weapon integrated along the central axis of the hull, making each individual vessel capable of the planetary devastation previously requiring an entire Death Star installation. The fleet numbered in the thousands, each one of them independently capable of ending a civilization. The axial superlaser is confirmed canon hardware with its own documented specifications. The Xyston exists. The axial superlaser is real. What this particular audience thinks about a design that puts Death Star-level killing capacity into a production run of thousands and then parks them in a hidden system for decades. That conversation is already ongoing, has been since December 2019, and doesn't require additional rehearsal here. The thread connecting all of these ships runs back to a single institutional moment, 18 BBY, Imperial Communique number 001044.92V, and the maxim that the galaxy is cheaper to control through terror than through force. The Tarkin Doctrine didn't formally decommission the Procurator or cancel the Praetor program. It did something more effective. It built a procurement culture with a strong preference for one type of ship and one design vocabulary, and allowed everything that didn't fit that vocabulary to accumulate at the institutional margins. The Imperial class became the standard. The Death Star became the statement. Kuat Drive Yards adapted its production priorities to match what the new government wanted, and the admirable officers who had built careers around carrier group doctrine and multi-role fleet flexibility found their operational philosophy deprioritized, not by decree, but by procurement. The ships that predated the doctrine, like the Procurator's 2-century-old hull, or the ships that exceeded the doctrine's preferred classification framework in ways the taxonomy couldn't comfortably accommodate, like both marks of the Praetor, ended up in a category that the standard lists inherited without examining. The Venator wasn't retired because it failed. It was retired because the doctrine that replaced the Republic didn't need what the Venator was designed to do. A hull capable of simultaneous carrier and warship operations was a hull built for a distributed, flexible war, exactly the war the Tarkin Doctrine intended to make irrational. Rule through fear of force, not force itself. The Venator's operational flexibility was force. An Imperial class in orbit was fear. One of those was expensive to replicate and difficult to deploy everywhere. The other was standardized. The list format reproduced the doctrine's curatorial decisions without meaning to. By anchoring to the official categories, Star Destroyer, then Executor class as the prestige finale, it inherited the same organizational frame the Imperial Procurement Office used, and excluded the same ships the Procurement Office found inconvenient to classify. The Praetor Mark II is too large for the Star Destroyer list, and too lightly armed for the Star Dreadnought list. The Procurator is too old for the Imperial-era focus, and too specialized for the multi-role framework the lists are built around. The gray zone ships fell through the taxonomic gap, and the lists kept falling through it after them, each one citing the previous one as its reference point. There's at least one ship this video still missed, and a few of you identified it before this segment ended and have been waiting to name it. That's not a failure of the research, it's a feature of a catalog that runs deeper than any single video can exhaust. Name it in the comments. Class designation, length if you have it, source material if you know it. The comment section on this one should go further than the video itself, and that's genuinely the intention. This isn't the definitive list. It's the one that finally took the gaps seriously. The ones still in it are yours to fill. If this kind of institutional history, why the ships that existed were the ships that existed, which ones the doctrine buried in the process, and what their absence tells you about the military philosophy that shaped the galaxy, is what brings you back, subscribe. There's more coming.